On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, trade ties between South Korea and Japan takes a turn for the worse. Can the U.S. mediate? And the art of the deal. A Stanford University senior fellow talks about tough trade negotiations. Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. We begin today's program in South Korea, where demonstrations continue over the weekend outside Japan's embassy in Seoul. They are angry over recent Japanese sanctions as the trade dispute escalated Friday when Tokyo removed South Korea from a list of favored trading partners. Seoul immediately announced it would do the same to Japan, saying Tokyo has, quote, crossed the line.
Two Asian economic heavyweights entangled in a trade dispute. Japan's cabinet approving a plan to remove South Korea from its so-called trade whitelist. That means Japanese exporters will now face more scrutiny and paperwork to obtain a permit to ship products to South Korea.
From the standpoint of Japan's national security, this revision was necessary to manage Japan's export system properly. For Japan-South Korea relation, there has been negative movements from South Korean side, and it is in a severe situation.
South Korea is hitting back. President Moon Jae-in saying his administration won't sit idly by.
I unequivocally warn that the Japanese government will be entirely held accountable for what will unfold going forward.
Relations turned sour last year when a South Korean court ruled in favor of compensating laborers forced to work for Japanese companies during World War II. And then last month, Japan began regulating shipments to South Korea of high-tech materials used in the production of computer chips and semiconductors. South Korean chip makers produce nearly two-thirds of the world's memory chips, which are supplied to companies like Apple and Huawei for use in their smartphones. In response, South Korea announcing it's removing Japan from its own whitelist and other possible diplomatic measures.
We will step up our preparations to file a WTO complaint as the reinforcement of Japan's export restrictions is violating WTO rules.
In Thailand, top diplomats from the United States, South Korea and Japan meeting for a regional security forum. But the trade spat loomed over what was supposed to be talks on the DPRK and denuclearization.
I was told that the United States has great concerns about this situation and it would play a role in helping resolve the matter. I think that the Japanese side should take responsibility for this situation, immediately withdraw the measure and make efforts to resolve the issue through dialogue.
South Korea is also considering pulling out of a military information sharing agreement with Japan, proving that this trade dispute could expand into other areas. But it's not just a concern for countries and their economies in this part of the world. The potential fallout could shake up global tech supply chains, proving ultimately that prices of smartphones and other electronics will likely go up.
If you look at it, the disputes not only hit Japan and South Korea, but also the world's two largest economies, China and the United States, in the Asia-Pacific region, that raised uncertainty in the region. Japan is the world's third largest economy, while South Korea is the world's 11th biggest. The exchange of trade blows among them doesn't help, certainly matters. So let's go to our panelists for some real answers. How bumpy is the road ahead for South Korea and Japan relations? In Boston, we have Myung-Koo Kang, a professor of political science at Baruch College. In Tokyo, we invited Takuji Okubo, who is the chief economist of Japan Micro Advisors. Last but not least, in our Beijing studio, Rong Ying, vice president of CIIS, the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I understand this is going to be a gentleman's discussion, so it's very happy to have both Japan and South Korea, as well as from China, the three gentlemen with me right now. Let me ask you, our professor, Mr. Kang, about your opinion first. What does it mean if the situation continues for South Korea, the tension between South Korea and Japan?
If the current tension and conflict goes on, definitely it's not good for everyone. It's mutually damaging and mutually losing game. But unfortunately, the current conflict between South Korea and Japan will last probably a little bit longer than most people expect. Right now, Abe administration's retaliatory measure probably last until the Abe administration lasts until September 2021. If that's the case, I think the current ongoing process would be really horrible, not only for these two countries, but entire Asia and the global so-called value chain aspect. As you pointed out, this increasing uncertainty has immediate impact of our own psychologists, investment psychologists, and then if you look at stock market and financial market in Asia today, it was really horrible because it has really negative impact about coming some uncertainty in the financial market.
All right, Professor Okubo, also your view here. What about for Japan? Now, of course, Japan was the one seems to be taken action at the very beginning during this round, at least. But what's going to be the impact for Japan economically, even?
So Japanese government stance is that this will only have a temporary effect. Japanese government position is that Japan is just removing South Korea from preferential treatment to normal treatment, which is applied to most other Asian nations such as Taiwan. So from Japanese government's point of view, this is a temporary measure. It shouldn't have this removing South Korea from a whitelist. This measure itself shouldn't have a long-lasting impact.
Even though countries and regions in Asia are mainly not necessarily on that so-called favorable list, but still understanding Japan and South Korea are allies of the United States, and as a result, there were reasons regionally why they put each other on each other's white list. So exactly what does it mean? Professor Kang, from your perspective, South Korea, as we understand, the chips are mainly imported from Japan. Would that mean South Korea have to divert its sources to look for different possibilities worldwide?
Right. I think from a short-term point of view, it can be a real pain to the South Korean economy and then to the South Korean people. But from a longer-term point of view, I think the current ongoing conflict with Japan can be a disguised blessing. So it can be a long-term gain for the Korean economy and the people. And I personally disagree with the commentator from the Japanese side because he highlighted it's just a temporary measure. But the Japanese government retaliatory measure right now is not just the economic retaliation. It touches upon the very important historical issue in the Japanese colonial rule and illegal activity of enforced labor and compensation issue, whether individual level compensation has been resolved or not. So from the South Korean people's point of view, the ongoing conflict is not just temporary, it's really long-lasting and it's a very serious issue. I think we should take into account such kind of aspects quite seriously.
Okay. Mr. Okubo, you heard your South Korean counterpart's argument. Now, if it really lasts until the end of the term of the Abe administration, that's going to be quite still some time to go. One could imagine the cooling of relationship between the two countries going spiraling down in a way.
So, well, Professor Khan is correct in a sense that Japan and South Korea share a lot of common interests. They are certainly allies, both in economic and military terms, especially with U.S. So deterioration between the relationship between Japan and South Korea is definitely not positive. I mean, how significant is debatable. It is definitely negative. However, you know, Japanese government's point of view is, well, Japan is not the only country to be blamed. I think Japanese government's argument or complaint is that Japan or South Korea seems to be kind of sidelining Japan when it comes to negotiation with North Korea. So, and then there are, and from Japanese government's point of view, current South Korea governments are taking measures that could actually radicalize, you know, anti-Japan sentiment within South Korea. So there are issues. There are a number of issues Japanese government is not very happy about with South Korean government. And I guess from Japanese government point of view, this is kind of a message to the government.
Well, I guess not happy is one thing. Doing extra steps when it comes to trade, which is the fundamental link between the two countries, is another thing. We are not here to judge which side is right, which side is wrong. We are only here to let others hear what are different voices coming from different sides. If you look at the integrated circuits, that is South Korea's top valuable exports last year, worth nearly $110 billion. Other electronic goods such as mobile phones, LCDs, and computer parts also make up the bulk of South Korea's most valuable exports. For Japan, integrated circuits exports are the third most valuable last year, to tune of $28 billion, with semiconductor machinery worth nearly $25 billion next in the list. So you can see it's going to be quite some impact for both economy, with no exaggeration. We have a Chinese guest sitting in the studio. Mr. Rong, been attentively listening to your two Northeast Asian colleagues from South Korea and Japan. Now, China is not here to judge, but what do you make of the trade impact for the region?
Well, indeed, I think China does not want to see that kind of trade dispute that is happening between South Korea and Japan. After all, I think for China, both Japan and South Korea are very important neighbors and are also trading partners. And we have we call CGTN China, Japan and South Korea, cooperation and working on the free trade negotiations, so on and so forth.
Is it still possible given the climate?
Certainly, I think there are a lot of difficulties given the current tension and the uncertainties that are out of that. And besides going beyond the CJK, there are also China, so-called 10+3, and East Asia economic cooperation and beyond. So China does not want to see that happen, having an ongoing trade dispute with the United States. But the question is, of course, is not for China to judge, but China have to manage the impact of that. China is in the sort of supply chain or value chain. So I think China certainly does not want to see that happen, and hope that the two countries would be able to work out of their problem, taking into account the complex sort of nature of the disputes, involving history, involving legal, involving politics and economy, and I think also equally important, involving a lot of emotions.
Certainly a lot of emotions, but we do not want to forget there are also a lot of trade issues going on. Professor Kang, go to you. Now, we see Japan and the United States, your Japanese counterpart will have something to say about that, I'm sure, later, has been working on their bilateral trade negotiations. Now, there were suggestions about, you know, Japan would be able to export cars to the United States, while the White House will be able to wipe out the tariffs of 3 to 6%. That's what the president could do with his capacity. And also, U.S. can export beef to Japan. Obviously, there seems to be some bilateral trade deals going on in the background. So what does South Korea has to offer so that Washington would also put its ears to the arguments of South Korea? Is that the real issue here?
It's a tough thing, but
it is.
Basically, the U.S. Trump administration's approach is dealing with maximizing U.S. national interest by dealing with trade issues bilateral way, one by one. So U.S. economic scale and influence is much bigger than any other countries in the world. So dealing with China bilaterally, dealing with Japan bilateral way, and dealing with South Korea bilateral way. But one more important dimension is the security dimension. As you know, United States is a very important ally to South Korea and very important security ally to Japan. So from American government point of view, maintaining trilateral alliance relationship between the United States and Japan and South Korea is very, very critical. But at the same time, in terms of dealing with trade or economic issue, United States always try to maintain this kind of vertical bilateral negotiation strategy. In other words, U.S. government strategy toward Asia is simply put is a kind of divide and conquer kind of rule. So for instance, as Chinese panelists pointed out, regional comprehensive economic partnership, ASEAN 10 countries and China, Japan, Korea, 13 countries, so intra-regional multilateral trade regime will be good for Asian countries. But from the American government point of view, dividing these Asian countries multilateral institution building is good for maximizing United States national interest. Well, so I think that's the ongoing complicated game.
It is a very complicated game. Well, our South Korean colleague is so sophisticated to understand that. I'm sure our Japanese guest, who is also sophisticated, would understand that logic very well. So why would Japan allow Washington to divide and conquer, at least in the latest case, it seems?
Well, Japan is not necessarily just following U.S. lead. Japan was, I think, instrumental in managing to get TPP, which is now CPTPP, or TPP-11, across the line. So U.S. abandoned the trade agreement. Japan was managed to put the agreement through. So Japan does continue to put emphasis on multilateral framework. And Japan is also positive to much wider Asian-wide agreement, RCEP. So I would say this Japan-South Korea trade tension is more of an exception rather than Japan's trade policy.
But on the other hand, Mr. Okubo, as we have noticed, this time the Abe administration was trying to use the reasoning of so-called, quote, national security in this regard. Now, there have been complaints about the United States exaggerating the role of national security without really giving concrete reasoning as to what about national security. So misuse and too widely use of national security. Do people like you in Japan also worry about the spread of misuse of national security in future trade negotiations and relations, whether it's with South Korea or with others?
I agree that using security reasons for everything is definitely not the right diplomatic strategy. So, and I personally, I have been explaining Japanese government's position, but my personal view is that yes, the Japanese government did overstep or being too forceful in taking this retaliation or countermeasure to South Korea. But then, well, the message was that more or less that the Japanese government just wanted to send some message to South Korea that there are certain elements of conduct by South Korean government, which Japanese government is unhappy, and Japan actually want to do more to cooperate with South Korea. So this retaliation is just part of the negotiation.
And therefore, I want to ask Mr. Rong as well, how do you see, all of you have talked about the regional mechanisms. It's not just one, but rather several. So will trade disputes now overshadow all the discussions about the regional trade mechanism? It's not just this trade dispute, but trade dispute between China and the United States, South Korea and Japan, probably more to go. Are we going to be taken off our tracks here in this region by trade disputes?
Indeed, I think the danger is there. I mean, if you look at the trade disputes, as talk, there are many trade disputes, but of course, a lot of them it is because of the United States has made a bad precedent, as we
all know, it's the largest economy in the world, so that's why a lot of people also.
And so trade disputes is there. Trade disputes is the reality, but how to manage the disputes is very important. I think we have the rules, we have WTO, but United States has made a bad precedent by, I mean, using the tariff, using the maximum pressure and things like that. This is something very bad. This is something damaging the process of regional sort of integration and the regional agreement. And more importantly, I think we call the multilateral trading system with WTO at the core.
Mr. Okubo, on that point, I want to come back to you again because Japan has been very instrumental, as you mentioned, in the process of working on CPTPP, which has been successful so far, and also be, as many see, a champion of free trade, particularly in recent years. Would the bilateral trade dispute in the name of national security with South Korea in a way disdain Japan's utmost efforts over the years in this regard? Many worried about it.
Yes, I do agree that this trade dispute between Japan and South Korea, it does undermine Japan's position that Japan's policy is open and free trade. So it does hurt Japan's diplomatic stance in this regard. But so I think going forward in the next, say, 6 months, I think Japan would probably want to climb down gradually. So try to quiet down this trade dispute between Japan and South Korea.
On the other hand, Professor Kang, do you think South Korea is also ready when the neighbor could cool down to a certain extent, because it really takes two to tango in a way, and we all know how important the economy is in this region. So Professor Kang, from South Korean perspective, what do you think about the immediate future? 6 months, let's just say.
I think it will disrupt ongoing, multilateral regional trade agreement, but at the same time, it will disrupt ongoing efforts to peace-building efforts in Northeast Asia. So in that sense, for the coming 6 months, the current conflict will have, negative impact. But let me highlight one important aspect. Japan, whatever the outcome, out of this conflict, Japan will lose its credibility as a leading nation in Asia. I mean, that's a very important issue. For instance, going back to 1997 Asian financial crisis, Japanese financial institutions withdraw money from Asian market. That was the fundamental cause of the Asian financial crisis. And at that time, when Korean banks asked for rollover of existing loans, Japanese financial institutions did not allow such kind of thing. Somewhat similar measure made by the Japanese government at the moment is a life-threatening measure to the Korean economy. For instance, it's estimated the Korean economic growth rate this year would go down at least 1% of GDP. So it's a cutthroat, really life-threatening measure. It's not just a normal measure from the Korean people's point of view. It's boxing. It's a kind of hitting below the belt kind of measure. So I think whatever the outcome, of course, it's mutually damaging outcome, but it will ultimately negative impact about Japanese status as a leading nation in Asia.
From both sides. Mr. Rong, is there any capable mediator between the two countries? I mean, if you think about the trilateral relations, South Korea, Japan, and the United States, do you think Washington is capable to do it this time now?
I'm not sure whether Washington is capable or willing to do that. First of all, I think despite the fact that the United States play not a very active role, it have tried. And the recent attempt, of course, is Secretary Pompeo, and that was
at the ASEAN meeting.
It was reported that he planned to have two sets of bilateral meetings before the trilateral. Unfortunately, it was turned down. And there are a lot of speculations of reason for that. One of the explanation or interpretation is the United States, either because it's not able to exercise that role, or it does not feel ready to do that. But either way, I think it shows that the conflict runs really deep. And I would like to echo that our Korean colleagues' view that for Japan, it might be a kind of a measure for retaliation to show that displeasure, while for the receiving side of South Korea, I think it's taken very seriously. If you look at the statements, look at the news reports, look at the reactions of South Koreans reacting to that, it is very much damaging. So as a Chinese, I think really hope that the relationship will not go that bad as that. So
because we have a lot at stake, gentlemen, in this region. Earlier, all of you talk about the geopolitics as well. It is not just geopolitics, but also nuclear security in Northeast Asia too. That's going to have a direct impact on all of us here in this region. As we know, Mr. Okubo, there were earlier encouraging signs. For example, even the United States President walk across the 38th parallel, be able to, in a way, show his attitude. But many, of course, suggest it's more of a gesture and a showbiz rather than real actions. Having said that, though, Mr. Okubo, as we know, the tough relationship between South Korea and Japan will absolutely have an impact on the security in the region, particularly regarding the nuclear issue. Mr. Okubo, how do you see the complex, entangled factors?
Right. So the summit between United States and North Korea after G20, I think it did help in de-escalating the tension. The problem is that it's just the policy is just being made up by U.S. President Trump alone. So there is no follow through. So in that regard, this closer cooperation, not just between the summit, but also among the bureaucrats, Japanese MOFA, Japanese foreign officials, South Korean officials, I think more government-wide efforts to an alliance with when U.S., South Korea, Japan, and China negotiate with North Korea, I think that is a very critical issue. Not just a summit, but it has to be a wider efforts to deal with and contain North Korea.
Very interesting, because right now it seems that both sides, in Pyongyang and Washington, they prefer bilateral rather than multilateral. Having said that, about the security issues, South Korea and the United States right now begin their joint military drills today after Pyongyang test-fired a series of short-range missiles in the past weeks. The drills will last for half a month and feature computer-simulated command post exercises to cope with any emergency, as they say. Pyongyang has denounced the new exercises as a violation of achievements made during previous inter-Korean and the Kim-Trump summits. Instead of binding together against the DPRK's nuclear threat, the two American allies apparently are now locked in their own bitter trade battle with the U.S. an apparent reluctant mediator or incapable mediator so far. So, Professor Kang, it would not be right if I don't ask the South Korean opinion. From your perspective, will things escalate, particularly after the trade dispute? Will parties involved in the nuclear security issue feel emboldened by the worsening relationship between Japan and South Korea?
Right. Right now, South Korean government, as far as I know, quite seriously thinking about canceling the military information sharing with the Japanese government. So based on the agreement, every August each year automatically renewed this military information sharing thing between the two governments. But the Korean government is quite serious about canceling as a countermeasure against the Japanese the national security excuse. So I think ongoing conflicts is really bad for building more stable and then serious discussions about denuclearization or peace-building efforts going on in Northeast Asia.
Right. Mr. Rong, we have only about 1 minute left. Your thoughts about this, because you've been working very hard on the denuclearization issue for many years too.
Well, I think so far on the question of the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, after the several sort of rounds of summit meetings, everything more or less is on the track. The only thing is, of course, the working level talks between the United States and North Korea. Hopefully, it would be resumed soon, and then the practical roadmap will be sort of worked out so that to implement the agreements or consensus that have been reached and supported. That has been always supporting and hoped by all the countries in the region, particularly China and South Korea and to some extent Japan.
Rong Ying, Myung Koo Kang, Kakuji Obuko, thank you so much for all of you. Thank you so much, gentlemen. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.